Let's see, we should be live on a couple different apps here. We are doing an interview with attorney Kamilah Moore. She was the chair of the Reparations Task Force. There's been a lot of news about it recently. And I think people know a lot about it, a little bit about it. And then some people think that is like reparations even possible. And so I think this is a super important conversation to have. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you and to educate folks about what's going on in the reparations movement, particularly in California, and then obviously how folks can get involved.
Absolutely. So here on Twitter, there was this video that seemed to go viral. This was taken, I think the day it was uploaded, right? September 6th. And we'll play it here and then we'll discuss what we're looking at.
The speaker needs to bring the bills up now. These are their bills. They have their names on the bills. They killing their own bills because they scared of the government. Now, listen, they gonna see this and they gonna get mad at us.
Are you guys letting people in yet? The thing's been going on for like 2 hours.
Yeah, so it's a pass only event over here on the assembly side.
Okay, well, how do we get a pass?
You gotta go to the second floor.
We've been to the second floor.
Oh, okay.
This is obstruction of justice, of the democratic process. Are you letting other people in? We're here, the other people are in.
Yeah. Hey, it's pass only event. I don't know if you've been let in the rest of the time.
Okay, well, how you have a pass-only event, but they're not handing out passes to get in? Or they're only handing out passes to certain people?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm here to present SB 1403.
What we are witnessing in the state of California is the very essence of political cowardliness,
which will establish the framework, the foundation for reparations here in the state of California.
So I guess what was that? And then if we could go in, you were the chair of the Reparation Task Force. Let's start with, once you explain context, if you will, what was the Reparation Task Force?
Yeah. Let's start from the beginning, crash course, so to speak. So the California Reparations Task Force was a 2-year state commission, a legislative advisory body. So the specific role of the task force was to advise the state legislature on the types of reparations proposals that they should turn into legislation and that the governor should sign into law. So the task force was created via a legislative bill that was passed called AB 3121. It was passed and signed into law by Governor Newsom October 2020, right after the heels of, the unjust murder of George Floyd and, that racial reckoning and, general reckoning that our nation seemed to be in, also helped to propel the legislation to create the task force. But, there were already organizers on the ground, like members of CJEC, which we'll talk about later, that, were working with then Assembly Member Shirley Weber, but now she's California's first African-American Secretary of State. It was then Assembly Member Shirley Weber that introduced this bill to create the task force. And like I said, Governor Newsom signed it into law October 2020. And so anyone, after the legislation was passed to create the task force, anyone could sign up to be on the task force, right? If you read the statute that created the task force. And so I was one of the folks, many of Californians who applied to be on the task force. I've studied reparations in the intersection of international law and human rights. I graduated from Columbia Law School and Amsterdam Law School, where I wrote like a master thesis on global reparatory justice for people of African descent. And so, I had graduated in 2019, like right before, this legislation came out. And when I read the legislation, once it passed, I saw a provision in there that said, whoever's on the task force, the final recommendations had to fully comport with international human rights law standards. And so essentially, I'm just sharing kind of how I got involved, what leverage did I use to make myself looked like a compelling candidate to be on the task force. So Governor Newsom picked 5 people to be on the task force. The Speaker of the State Assembly at the time, Anthony Rendon, picked 2 people to be on the task force. I was appointed by Speaker Anthony Rendon. And then the President of the State Senate at the time, Tony Atkins, picked 2 people on the task force. So in all, there were 9 members on the task force, and we worked from June 2021 to June 2023, hosting over 16 public hearings on. Obviously, we started with talking about slavery and even California's role in slavery, but most of the hearings were about the badges and incidents of slavery, ongoing discrimination, against Black Americans in the state of California, from political disenfranchisement, racism in the environment and infrastructure, the criminal legal system, the wealth gap, and we can go on and on and on. And so I'll stop there, but I'll just say that gives some context in terms of who was on the task force, what the task force was tasked to do. In terms of our outcomes, we produced an 1,100-page final report chronicling all the badges and incidents of slavery that Black Americans have suffered through in the state and federally, but it also includes 200 policy recommendations, that the state legislature is now tasked with picking out, those recommendations, turning them into legislation, and then Newsom would be tasked to sign, those bills into law. And so just one quick point, and then I'll conclude, just to wrap this up, in a bow. The task force, we had our last hearing June 29th, 2023. And so at that point afterwards, you have the California Legislative Black Caucus taking the initiative amongst all of the legislators in the legislature to introduce the first set of reparations bills for Black Americans in the state of California. Also, certain Black Caucus members also introduced bills kind of independent of the caucus, namely Senator Stephen Bradford initially. And, we'll get into that. But that's kind of where we are, where we are, right? Now that the task force is over, it's the Black Caucus that is taking the initiative to introduce reparations bills. And so, what this video describes is last day of the legislative session, August 31st. You had reparationists, demonstrators traveling all across the state of California, some even across the country, the last minute, to see or to put pressure on the California Legislative Black Caucus members to introduce 2 historic reparations bills that were originally introduced independently of the caucus by Senator Stephen Bradford, who one of them would have created a reparations agency, SB 1403, for descendants of American slaves in the state of California, and another would have created a reparations fund, Senate Bill 1331. Also a fund to fund reparations programs and policies for descendants of American slaves. And so, although Senator Stephen Bradford introduced those 2 bills independently of the caucus initially, there was rumblings that the Black Caucus wasn't happy about that because they felt like Bradford was kind of like grandstanding in kind of bringing these bills on his own. Eventually, it seemed to be that the Black Caucus members kind of got over that because, around May of this year, the Black Caucus actually endorsed the agency bill, SB 1403, put it a part of its reparations priority package, and then also asked for funding for this agency. But at the last minute, in the last few days of session, essentially kind of reneged on that commitment to introduce the agency bill to the assembly floor for a final vote. And so that's kind of where we are right now, where the community is kind of wanting answers, are confused, to be quite honest, as to why the Black Caucus at the last minute decided not to support the reparations agency bill, decided not to introduce that bill to the assembly floor for consideration for a final vote. That would have been the last step right? That bill went through committees all throughout the state Senate and the state assembly successfully throughout this entire 8-month legislative process. Having the Black Caucus members introduce that bill to the assembly floor the final few days of session would have been the last step needed for that bill to go to Governor Newsom's desk for consideration to either sign or veto. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I'm happy to kind of unpack, but that's just kind of where we are, where the community is actually really confused and is looking for some answers as to why that occurred on August 31st.
Yeah, and has there been any response from anybody regarding this, or any, at all?
Yes, there has been some response. So the California Legislative Black Caucus, the last day of legislative session, while reparations demonstrators were at the Capitol, literally we were there until midnight. We weren't giving up in terms of trying to get someone in the assembly to introduce these bills on the floor by the deadline. The CLBC released a statement that night, like before midnight, pretty much telling people that they would not be introducing these bills on the floor. Some of their reasoning, included something like the agency they felt like would have, extended too much authority to the agency, and they felt like they would have relinquished some authority over certain things. Is something that they stated. Also, something else that kind of colors this discussion is that Governor Newsom's office actually approached Senator Stephen Bradford with amendments kind of at the last minute as well. So, the last day to pass bills was August 31st. I believe Governor Newsom's office reached out to Bradford with amendments to change the agency bill around August 26th. And the amendments would have changed the agency bill to a 2-year additional study. So instead of the agency bill where, that agency would be set up to, process reparations claims for various different things like mass incarceration, over policing, or unjust property takings, things that the task force has already studied. Governor Newsom's office wanted to amend the agency to pretty much change it to, again, a 2-year additional study to be conducted by the Cal States and supported by nonprofits. And Senator Stephen Bradford, rejected those amendments, saying that it would fundamentally alter and change the nature, purpose, intent of this agency. And so, some of the reasoning the Black Caucus gave in not bringing the agency bill to the floor was, we didn't have enough time to really negotiate and talk about Governor Newsom's amendments. But to answer your question more directly, yes. So certain CLBC members have, provided various different reasons, have provided various different public statements. A couple have gone on a local radio show, KBLA, Dominique DePrima, all kind of giving their own kind of reasoning. A few elected officials, assembly members, Black Caucus members have showed up to town halls that community organizers have organized in LA and Sacramento. And so, yeah, I'm happy to go into more detail, but at the end of the day, like they've started to, share why, they decided to not bring these bills to the floor. For instance, Assemblymember Mia Bonta at an event in Sacramento a couple of days ago said she didn't bring the reparations fund bill to the floor, which she was responsible for, that bill in particular. She said she didn't bring the bill to the floor because she didn't think Governor Newsom would sign them. She thought that Governor Newsom would veto them. And so that's also one of the major kind of reasoning. I don't want to say excuses. I don't want to sound biased, but some of the reasoning the Black Caucus has given the community. They felt that, Newsom would veto the agency bill or the fund bill. So they didn't even want to bring it up to the assembly floor for a vote.
I can't imagine how it would really feel like and when did this start? When did you first start and join this task force? What was the year?
Yes, June 2021.
2021. So for 3 years, you've been essentially
working on this,
researching and studying and looking into and investigating. To hear that he's saying it needs 2 more years, that certainly must have felt like, and well, I would say a slap in the face if it was me. Do you think that in the timing, it seems almost like intentional, to wait that late to give them that, and then they have an excuse to say, oh, we didn't have enough time to go over it? That's so suspect. That seems like kind of a waste of the people's times you put together and such qualified people that you put together to try to address this issue. What were some of the outcomes of the task force specifically?
Sure. We in our first year we completed a 500-page report, which was really like a harm report, where we were documenting and compiling all the evidence to substantiate a claim for reparations for descendants of American slaves on a state level. So again, uncovering the state of California's role in slavery, the fact that there was slavery here in the state. A lot of Southern enslavers brought their enslaved, chattel property to the state of California during the gold rush. There were slave colonies, in San Bernardino County, for instance. California had a fugitive slave law, so the state was not a sanctuary state by any means. If there was an enslaved person who ran away here to California for refuge, under that law, they could be deported to be re-enslaved back in the South, or in some instances enslaved on California soil. So I think high level, a lot of the outcomes of the task force was kind of demystifying, dismantling, I would say, like these myths and narratives that kind of obstruct us from, achieving full reparatory justice for descendants of American slaves, like arguments that California was not a slave state or didn't have slavery. But again, we also uncovered and we identified 12 lingering badges and incidents of slavery, 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that still persist in the society and that disproportionately impact descendants of slaves, some of which I already mentioned, like political disenfranchisement, criminal legal system, wealth gap, racism in the environment and infrastructure, housing segregation and homelessness, separate and unequal education. And we could really go on and on and on.
Right.
And so the final outcome was like I said earlier, that 1,100-page final report with those, 200 plus policy recommendations. We also, outside of the 16 public hearings, we partnered with organizations to do community listening sessions, to get further community input. And so, that's generally kind of, what the outcomes were.
Okay, sticking to a specific question, or what is the biggest misconceptions in California do you think there are about slavery, in terms of like how recent maybe it ended or it existed, etc.?
Yeah. Question. Yes. I would say, for one, and this is things that I actually learned while I was on the task force. I didn't know this. I didn't learn this when I was in school, and I was born and raised in California, right? That idea. And there's still obvious education that needs to be done, because sometimes when I'm on social media, I'm still getting conservatives and, Republicans or whoever, challenging, saying, California was not a slave state, or California didn't have slavery. One of the things that we learned, for instance, is that California's first governor, his name was, and we learned this through the expertise and wisdom and knowledge, I would say, of the vice chair of the task force, Pastor Amos Brown. He's based in San Francisco. He's a president of NAACP San Francisco, and he's on the board of directors for the National Org. And he was one of 16 students to be taught by the late Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Way back in the day when he taught at Morehouse Seminary School. And so we learned from Vice Chair Amos Brown that, the first governor of California was Peter Hardeman Burnett. And when he was in, also before Peter lived in California, he was in the legislature for, I believe, Oregon. And, Oregon was the state under, his influence in the Oregon legislature passed a law that would not allow Black people to live in the state of Oregon. And so Peter Hardeman Burnett, when he was governor, essentially tried to do the same thing in California, but it failed. But, again, California's had a fugitive slave law, which actually was rare for free states at the time. Most free states didn't adopt a fugitive slave law where they essentially said, okay, well, if runaways come to our state, we'll help the slave states out, right? That's something that California decided to do in 1852, 2 years before, 2 years after it became a state. So there's other things too, but it kind of
no, that's good info that I didn't know. So I appreciate it as a California native. What is the latest in terms of us and what we need to know as the community to hold these political leaders or anybody accountable that we would have trusted to enact correctly in this capacity?
Right. That's a great question. I think right now, well, one, just speaking directly to your question, the legislature reconvenes, gets back into its new session, starts its new session rather, in less than 90 days, right? They come back to work at the end of December, but they'll most likely be introducing, new reparations bills at the top of 2025, like in January, kind of like how they did this past year. They introduced their bills January 31st of this past year. But say all that to say, at this point in time, look, 2 weeks has passed since the Black Caucus, decided not to bring these bills to the floor. And these past 2 weeks, the community has pretty much engaged in accountability sessions, right? Through town halls, through engaging with various different types of media, trying to get, going to the COBC's own events, trying to speak directly to legislators and public. So I say all that to say, I think right now we're in a space where the community righteously is still in a mode where they're kind of, they're expressing their hurt, which I think is fair. Only 2 weeks has passed since this has happened. But to your point, we're starting to get into a phase where action needs to be prioritized. And, realistically speaking, even though a good contingent of the Black community across the state of California is very disappointed in the CLBC members, and they're all up for re-election this November. I mean, the idea that these members will be voted out at this particular time, less than 50 days into the election, is probably not going to happen. So I say all that to say, the same members that made this huge mistake are most likely also going to remain in the Black Caucus for this next session. So what is it going to look like to kind of restore the trust that has been fundamentally broken between the caucus and their Black constituents? And so I say all that to say, I don't know what that's going to look like, but we're all going to have to figure it out in less than 90 days. But I will say, organizations that have been on the ground doing this work, Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, CJEC, they are organizing volunteer sessions. They have one coming up. I'll be happy to share with your audience, where their goal is to recruit an X amount of volunteers at a certain point of time to receive training and get engaged, to put the necessary and appropriate pressure on the Black Caucus, but the entire state legislature, to reintroduce these bills and even more stronger bills in this next session.
No, that's really good to know. Where are you on social media? You're on Twitter, on X, on Instagram. Will you share your socials?
Yes, so I am on X, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, across all social media. It's Kamilah V. Moore. Yeah.
Okay, and you
And
see
my
her
website,
on your website. What's your website?
CamilahMoore.com.
Kamilah Moore. And so it's a V in the middle of her first and last name for her socials. And when we get that date, is that something you'll be sharing? And you would encourage like people to go and start voicing their concern in any way, or at least getting more educated?
Yes, so the volunteer session is Wednesday, October 2nd, 6:30 to 8 p.m. And that's hosted by CJEC, Coalition for Just and Equitable California. I believe their website is cjecofficial.org. So yeah, that's this up. Sorry, October 2nd. I was gonna say upcoming Wednesday, but it's not. Yeah.
Well, okay. I think until we get to those 90 days, we can continue getting educated, building awareness. And then if there's any updates that happen, we're happy to continue this conversation. And always happy to hear you speak on anything regarding this issue. So we really appreciate your time. And is there anything else you'd want to share or let anyone know?
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I would like to say thank you again, Shanette, for this opportunity. The second part, that's lingering, but I'm happy to, talk about this at another time where, there was a letter that a journalist posted today that revealed that the CLBC in May of this year wrote a letter to the governor saying that they endorsed and they supported SB 1403, the reparations agency bill that Bradford introduced initially on his own, but they endorsed it and put it a part of its official package. And they actually also requested for the governor to give $6 million to fund this agency, which was good, right? An act of good faith, right? The agency was an official recommendation from the task force. But in the same letter, although very troubling, the CLBC asked for $6 million to go to a nonprofit foundation called the California Black Freedom Fund. That was not part of the task force's recommendations to give X amount of money to the California Black Freedom Fund. Right, that $12 million allocation actually from the governor for this next year's budget, specifically when you see the writing of the budget description, is to go to implement reparations legislation. So in all, that letter that was released today is troubling for a couple of reasons, because again, at the last minute, for some reason, and we're still trying to drill down the true answers for why this happened, at the last minute, the Black Caucus decided not to introduce SB 1403 to the Assembly floor for a final vote. Although in May, they're in writing supporting the agency bill and formally requesting $6 million for the funding of the bill. So what happened essentially between May and the last day of the legislative session, where in May they were all for the agency bill, the last couple of days they were completely unaccountable to the people, completely reneged on the commitment to introduce this bill to the floor for Bradford and the community. And then the other part that's troubling to me personally is the fact that there's this ask by the Black Caucus to give $6 million to a cadre of nonprofits that they're affiliated with. To me, that diverts resources that should go to direct reparations, right? Directly to descendants of enslaved people, right? Nonprofits were not harmed by slavery and Jim Crow, right? People were human beings, right? My ancestors, right, in which I'm standing in the shoes of them. And, living descendants of American slaves have dealt and endured with harms, not nonprofit entities. So, since this letter has gone out, since this issue has gotten media attention, luckily, right, the executive director of the Black Freedom Fund, Mark Philpart, has started to openly and publicly make statements backing away from the money, saying, yes, this letter exists where the Black Caucus has stated they're trying to give me $6 million, but I don't want the money. I don't know what our foundation would have done with the money in terms of trying to implement reparations legislation. So I'll say all that to say the pressure is actually working, because if this pressure didn't exist, essentially,
this document wouldn't have gotten released, right? Publicly.
Right, exactly. And I mean, if the pressure wasn't on, essentially you would have the Black Caucus being not held accountable for answering to why they did not introduce these bills, but then also you would be seeing money going to a source or entity that doesn't need it or deserve it.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
No, continue. Sorry. No.
Oh, that's where we're at right now. So like, people might be thinking like folks are going too hard, but I mean, we're being appropriate. No, we're not endorsing any bad behavior. We're, endorsing exercising our constitutional rights, right? To assemble, to ask questions. And, these people are here to serve us as constituents, as individuals, as communities, not their nonprofit friends. So I just brought that up to say that's another element of this conversation.
A huge element that came out this morning. We, by the way, have it on the screen. So as you were talking, we've been looking at it. So, I mean, that's nearly breaking news of what seems typical. It's like Newsom puts together people to look into an issue. Okay, they look into it. Now you want to just it's like forever studies and forever looking into things and without ever actually resolving the stuff. And it's like how we have to just end that, because I know this is happening, I'm certain, in other issues, but it seems pretty obvious. And for how close it is, I think the public definitely needs to know in general that, because I think there's definitely a notion that reparations isn't even possible or that could never happen. And look at the extent they're going, to try to keep talking about it, but not actually doing the right thing. So is there any petitions out, or those things are kind of being worked on, but at the moment, or is there any call to actions on any of these particular people?
There's various different petitions floating around. One of them being, demanding the governor to, create a special session on reparations, kind of similar to the special session he just convened on oil and gas. So that's being, spread, but, also.
Oh. It cut out for a sec. Let's see. Hello? Oh, no.
Trying to essentially, have their opponents win or make it look like a very close race. So the CWC members understand, power to the people, right? And so that's definitely happening that I'm seeing. Reparation is supporting candidates that are opposing the COBC in this November election. But again, I think what people are mainly focusing on is the fact that, we got to get back to work in terms of engaging the state legislature in less than 90 days and kind of building power and capacity for that. One last thing I'll say, though, is to your point that you mentioned earlier, I just feel like they didn't understand. I mean, they probably felt like this was all going to go away. They didn't think that, most people would care. And, these bills were very close. The bill to create a reparations fund and a state agency for descendants of American slaves in the state of California were very close to Governor Newsom's desk. Literally was on its last step before it would have been on his desk, where he would have had between September 1st and September 30th of this year to decide whether he would sign or veto them. So basically, the Black Caucus carried Newsom's water and agreed essentially not to bring these bills to the assembly floor because they would have gotten the votes. The full assembly would have voted for it, and then Newsom would have been presented with this, huge decision. What do I do? Do I sign or veto these bills to create a reparations fund or agency? And he probably would have gotten a lot of, response either way, whether he signed it or whether he vetoed it. And he felt, most likely his team felt they couldn't afford that, at least not right now in this election cycle and the season that we're in. And I say all that to say, most people have low-key kind of been disengaged in this fight for reparations nationally and even in the state of California, even with this task force going, because people felt it was so improbable or pie in the sky type thing. But I feel like since most people saw how close these bills got to Governor Newsom's desk, they're realizing that this is a real movement, right? Reparations is a real movement, and that we could literally see reparations in our lifetime in this state and in this country. And so ironically, what some folks meant for bad has turned out to be really a true blessing and a great opportunity that I think accelerates this movement for reparative justice. So I'm excited for this upcoming year in this legislative session. So yes, thanks again for the opportunity to share.
No, of course. And I think it's only going to provide more light to the issue, and hopefully the people who are involved with being complicit with not doing anything about it step aside or do something. I read in this book, I think it's called The Activist Handbook, and it makes it pretty clear, it makes of course sense, that all a politician really ends up caring about is votes. And the more votes that they think not only they'll get but not lose for a particular issue, they end up prioritizing. It's it's just simple. The top issue, they realize that it will garnish the most votes, and then it just goes from there. And so the more people who write, even their local, national, state, all of it for reparations, it will only create a conversation that they know that they'll have to deal with. And the more people that do it, not just we'll vote for you if you do this, but we won't vote for you if you don't do anything about it. And I think the conversation and the momentum's changing, and let's just keep it up. But thank you so much for your time, and we'll stay in touch and keep sharing everything you do.
Thank you so much, Mr. Checkpoint. Appreciate you.
Of course.
Thanks, everybody.
All righty. Peace.